Good evening, everyone. We're going to be teaching from up here this evening because we're having some technical difficulties with the other laptop that allows you to teach from down there and use the overhead. So we'll just go with the flow. We're going to be, we finished up with Ezra and moving on to Nehemiah. And tonight we're going to try to cover the first 3 chapters of Nehemiah. So if you want to turn your books there, and ever heard someone say, someone ought to do something? Someone ought to do something about it. Have you ever looked at a situation and said those words? Whether it's a need for teachers within the congregation, whether it's a need of brethren that are in some other part of the country or maybe even some other part of the world that have suffered some type of devastation. We've seen some in the past where some have been victims of hurricanes and tornadoes, typhoons in the Philippines and whatnot. You perhaps can think of some others, but you found yourself saying, somebody ought to do something about that. This may be what you think when you consider some big need that you see in the church, in ministry, or even something in your community that you see something needs to be done. And you feel like you want to do something, but what can you do? Ever felt kind of helpless in those situations? I'm just one person. What can I do? If you've ever empathized with those feelings, then you'll understand the passion that Nehemiah felt for Jerusalem. You may recall from the book of Ezra, let me turn back there to chapter 2, Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2, it names some of the individuals that had come with Zerubbabel, the first leader that brought Israel back to, or Judah rather, back to Jerusalem with the intent of rebuilding the temple. Ezra will come a little bit later, as we saw in that. But in Ezra 2 and verse 2, some of the individuals that were named that went with Zerubbabel on that first campaign was Nehemiah. Mordecai is also mentioned, and we're going to talk about him next month when we get into the book of Esther. But Nehemiah has already been to Jerusalem and been a part of that activity in rebuilding the temple. How involved he was, we don't really know, because when we come to the book of Nehemiah, he's already returned back to Persia to serve the king. Whether he was involved in building the first altar, and in which they dedicated themselves and the materials that were going to be used to build the temple, whether he was a part of that or not, we don't know. Whether he was there when the temple was completed, or even when Ezra finally came onto the scene. But we find him here in Nehemiah, back in the citadel of Susa, as he mentions in chapter 1 and verse 1. And he's going to hear some news that's upsetting to him. And I want us to, as we look at the book of Nehemiah, I mentioned in the past that there is a need among not only this congregation, but other churches of Christ, a need for people to rise to the occasion, to be leaders among God's people. And Nehemiah is one of those individuals. And I want us to be looking and thinking about that aspect of Nehemiah as we take a look at this particular book. But I want to say that when God wants to use you, He requires a humble heart and courage to do God's work God's way. We should keep that in mind as we take a look at the book of Nehemiah. So let's turn to Nehemiah 1, if you're not already there, and begin reading at verse 1. The Bible says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have burned with fire. So when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now, I want you to kind of get the full picture here. Nehemiah, as I mentioned, had been back to Jerusalem. How involved, we don't know, but was part of the reconstruction of the temple, and had since returned back to the capital of Persia to serve the king. Oh, it doesn't say it here, and there's nothing that really indicates in this context the timeline that we're looking at, but approximately 60 years have gone by since Nehemiah was in Jerusalem. He's gone back and to serve the king in the capacity that he's going to fill. And during this time, the temple was completed, and people got back to working and worshiping God and living their daily lives. But the circumstances that we find these people, this remnant back in Judah, is not good. And it weighs heavy on Nehemiah's heart. So when some of these men had come back from Judah, he wants to know, what condition are they in? How are they doing? And as I said, the news is not good. They said that they are in great trouble and disgrace, and lay part of the reason for this on the fact that the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. The wall of Jerusalem was the fortress for that city. It was the last barrier of protection against all enemies. And it was important to Nehemiah that the people of God remain safe and secure, but they weren't there. The walls had been torn down. While a great effort went into rebuilding the temple, the work of protecting God's people went undone. And as we saw from Ezra, and we're going to see from Nehemiah, there are enemies of the people of God that want to do them harm, that want to see them fail. But Nehemiah is the man that wants to see God's people succeed. And he knows that the only way for them to be safe and secure is to rebuild those walls. But his reaction is one of such that he immediately begins to weep. Verse 4 says, "When I heard these news, I sat down and I wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed." How long did Nehemiah mourn and fast and pray? We're given an indication in chapter 1, verse 1. The Bible says, in the month of Kislev is when this event took place, as men returned, and Nehemiah inquires about what happens. In chapter 2, when Nehemiah gets the opportunity to be before the king and make the request that he wants to make, we're told that it's in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Kislev is equivalent to our November, December, right around that period of time. And Nisan is equivalent to our March and April. So from that, we can deduce that approximately 4 months went by where Nehemiah mourned and wept and prayed. The last time you heard some news that wasn't good about God's people, or any other circumstance, did you pray about it for 4 months? Did it weigh heavy on your heart for 4 months? It did on Nehemiah. But I think there's some other things going on during this time that we'll kind of bring out as we get to chapter 2. But Nehemiah continues on. He says in verse 5, after he says he mourned, fasted, and prayed, he then shares with us the prayer to God. And he said, "Then I said, the Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws which you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave to your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are the farthest, or rather are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place that I have chosen as a dwelling for my family, or for my name. There are your servants, they are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. This man being the king, as Nehemiah then identifies himself as, I was the cupbearer to the king. Very quickly, Nehemiah's prayer began with confessing the sins of not only himself, but of all the people of Israel, and then claiming the promises that God had made, that if God's people return to him, look to him, it doesn't matter how far scattered they are, God will bring them back to this land of promise. And so he asked God to hear this prayer and help Nehemiah accomplish what he wants to get done. And that, of course, is going to be rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. But he identifies himself at this point as the cupbearer. What is a cupbearer? Anyone? Oh, Janine? Yes, that's one of the responsibilities of a cupbearer. He was responsible for tasting not only the wine, but all the food that the king would eat. Because the king had his own enemies. And that food could be poisoned. So that's the kind of position Nehemiah had. If the food was poisoned, sorry for Nehemiah, but long live the king. Okay? So it was an awesome responsibility. It's more than just a holder of cups. It really was a humble title for an important post. The cupbearer was actually considered to be a high-ranking official in charge of serving the king. It was a very esteemed and honorable position that he fulfilled. Okay? It was one who was trustworthy. The king put his full confidence in him to make sure that the king stayed safe and well. So it demanded someone who was going to be loyal to the king. It was also one that was trained in court etiquette. It was one who maintained control of the king's wine cellar, a companion and a sounding board for the king. And perhaps we'll see some of that as we get into chapter 2. And even power to grant or deny access to the king. Nehemiah was loyal to the king and worked with a good and positive attitude. Proverbs 22, verse 29 says, "Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings." That's the kind of man Nehemiah was. Colossians 3, verse 23 says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." The way we work is a reflection of our relationship with God. Nehemiah's service is a reminder to hard work faithfully and with a good attitude, no matter what our role. When we work hard and show that we can be trusted, God is honored and others take notice. But again, let's go back to that thought that when God wants to use you, he requires a humble heart and courage to do God's work. So we come to chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought before the king. And Nehemiah says, "I took the wine and gave it to the king, and I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?' This can be nothing but sadness of heart." And Nehemiah's reaction to those words was, "I was very much afraid." Why do you think he was afraid? Anyone?
I think he was afraid for the people. He was afraid for what was going to happen, considering the apparent lousy start. And he really believed they had done something really wrong, sinned against God, and that's why they were where they are.
Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts? Judy?
I'm not sure, but he was kind of shocked
Yeah, that's something you really didn't want to do, was show sadness before the king. You want to show a positive attitude at all times. Mitch?
I don't think he was trying to, except that he had, at least in his version, this idea he had not been sad at his presence, but apparently showed. Maybe he was worried that showed through. He was trying to hide it. I don't know. It seems like that's what's implied.
Yeah, yeah. I think he was trying to hide it, but it's a testimony to how upset he really was about this whole situation for God's people in Judah, and how much it really weighed on his heart. He didn't intend to demonstrate a sad countenance before the king, but it came through, and the king noticed. But there may be another reason why he may be afraid. It's because he knows this is going to be his opportunity to ask the king this great question. And will the king answer it? Have you ever been standing before a high official and asking them for something that may seem impossible to you? You ever feel nervous? Ever feel afraid? His response was, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed with fire?" And the king said to me, "What is it you want?" And then he says, "I prayed to the God of heaven, and then I answered the king." Let's stop there for just a minute. What kind of prayer do you think he offered God right there? I mean, who stands before a king and gets down on his knees and prays? Do you think he offered the kind of prayer that he talks about in chapter 1? I don't think so. Some have referred to this kind of prayer as an arrow prayer, where you shoot a quick plea to God. "Lord, please be with me." Something of that nature. Because he then answers the king immediately with what he wants. He says, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." And then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Let's stop there for just a minute. A lot of questions are being fired at Nehemiah here as he tells the king what's got him so upset. And he expresses the fact that he wants to go back and help these people rebuild the wall. And the king is firing questions at him. How long are you going to be? Did Nehemiah say, "Well, I don't know, haven't really taken that into consideration. I'm not sure how long it would take to really get it done"? Is that the kind of response he gave? No. It says he set a time. I don't know about you, but that tells me that during those 4 months while Nehemiah was praying about this whole circumstance, he was doing more than just praying. He was planning, setting goals. If we're going to rebuild this wall, here's what it's going to take. Here's how much time it's going to take. It's going to include time to get there, get the supplies, rebuild the wall, get back to Susa, and continue fulfilling my capacity as a cupbearer. Nehemiah had the answers ready to go as soon as the king fired them at him. That's a person that thinks about what needs to be done and plans for all contingencies. Verse 7, he says, "I also said to him, If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence that I will occupy. Nehemiah's thought of all of these things that he's going to need, including his own quarters. Going to have some place to stay. And he says, and because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. And when Sanballat and Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So Nehemiah demonstrates the fact that he knows how to plan for this whole task that is at hand, and had answers ready to go for the king. We come to chapter 2 and verse 11, and Nehemiah says, I went to Jerusalem after staying there 3 days, and I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. And then he goes on, and this is what I have listed here, verse 13 through verse 16, of his going at night and inspecting the walls around Jerusalem. You notice he says, by night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem and so on. And we got this map here. So he says he started out, that working? I went shooting with Mitch and his boys yesterday, and my aim with this is about as good as my aim yesterday. Here we go. So he started out at the valley gate. This red barrier here is representing the wall here. He started at the valley gate, and he says he went down to the dung gate, then up to the fountain gate, and started to go up here. And then the wall was, during this section on the east side of Jerusalem, was so torn up in disarray that there was no way for him to walk along the wall to inspect it. So he went down through the valley, which would have been located right about here, and saw from a distance the wall, and then eventually came back down and entered back through the valley gate. That's what Nehemiah 2 verses 11 through 16 are telling us. What's the main thing that he's inspecting here besides the wall? It's highlighted there in the text. Did I hear someone say it? The gates, yes. Why does he want to inspect the gates?
Get enough lumber to repair it.
Okay, he's going to need to know how much lumber to repair. What do you think the first thing he's going to want fixed are? It's the gates. Because the gates give access to the city of Jerusalem. If he's going to protect the people and protect the city of Jerusalem, those gates need to be repaired so that they can shut the gates and keep their enemies at bay. Yes?
Does that mean there was enough wall up to have gates fixed? Because if the walls are down, wouldn't you have a wall fixed first before the gates?
There was perhaps some of the wall there, but we're going to see in chapter 3, there's going to be a whole host of people that are going to be working on all around this wall. It was literally torn down and the gates burned by Nebuchadnezzar when Judah was taken away to Babylon in captivity. But it was in such disarray that there was concern on his part that the enemies could enter at any time. They needed to be boarded up or repaired rather, so they can keep those enemies at bay. Okay? All right, so with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. We're going to shift gears a little bit and start thinking about this aspect of what kind of leadership qualities did Nehemiah demonstrate. And there's some clues there, up there on that chalkboard up there. Empowering people, inspiring people, leading change, shared vision. When we come to chapter 2 and verse 17, Nehemiah really begins to demonstrate his ability as a leader. He's already demonstrated some in what he's told us about this whole circumstance and how he's responded to it in chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. But in chapter 2 and verse 17, the Bible says, "Then I said to them," this is after he's gone out at night and inspected the walls. He's going to gather the leaders together, and he's going to say to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, "Let's start building." So they began with this good work. What are some of the qualities of a leader? I took the liberty of posting some, so you don't have to think too hard about it. But a leader will share a vision. They want to take somebody and do something. They need to explain what it is they want to do. So a good leader will share the vision. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does in this context. Okay? A leader will also set clear goals. I believe Nehemiah took the time during those 4 months before he had the opportunity to ask the king to let him go back to Jerusalem to do some planning, set some goals. So when he was questioned by the king, he was ready with answers and then shared those goals with the leaders and officials when he returned to Jerusalem. Okay? A good leader also leads by example. Nehemiah went out on his own during the night and inspected the wall. Tallied up what needed to be done. And he too is going to join in the reconstruction of this building. He's not going to stand back and say, "You people need to get working and do this job." He's going to get his hands dirty too. We'll see more of that later on in the book of Nehemiah. But he's also going to encourage teamwork. When you look at chapter 3, we haven't read any of that yet, and we're not going to read chapter 3, but it's part of our study tonight. You'll see that Nehemiah starts with the wall of Jerusalem at the northwestern corner and will work his way counterclockwise, enlisting the different positions, the gates, the posts, the walls, all the way around Jerusalem, and the individuals that were assigned to take care of those portions of the wall. And it wasn't just one person at this post. Chapter 3 enumerates the individuals that were assigned. Multiple people assigned to just one portion. And he did so all the way around the wall of Jerusalem. Nehemiah would encourage teamwork. A good leader is also one that is optimistic and positive. And Nehemiah was this kind of person. When he spoke to the officials, he said, Come, let us rebuild the wall. Our God, our gracious God, is with us, and we can do this. He was optimistic and fired these people up to get to work on rebuilding the wall. A good leader will also give praise and acknowledge those that accomplish great things under him. And it's one of the reasons I believe Nehemiah takes the time in chapter 3 to tell us about all the individuals that went to work on the wall. No matter how great a position you are given or how small it may be, a good leader always acknowledges what you're able to accomplish. And a good leader will also communicate with the team. And Nehemiah also demonstrates this. And then also, he will empower team members. And again, he does this. If you take the time to read chapter 3, look at all the individuals that are assigned to help with that job. Okay? Let's move on real quickly. A leader also knows how to face challenges, and they typically face them head on. And Nehemiah was this kind of person. In chapter 19, we are told that when Sanballat and the Horonite and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, and Geshem and Arab heard about it, they mocked and they ridiculed us. "What is this you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" Notice Nehemiah's response. He said, "I answered them, saying, the God of heaven will give us success." Talk about an optimistic leader. God is going to give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or in any claim or historic right to it. He cut them off right then and there and dealt with the opposition. All right, the last couple minutes, I just want to share with you some other lessons from Nehemiah that I think we ought to glean. Number one is full-time ministry is not required. When we started the class this evening, I raised the question, have you ever said the words, somebody ought to do something about it? You know who typically gets assigned to do that job? It's the preacher. Right, Randy? I've been there before, and I know it does. That's typically the mindset of the congregation is, well, we hired somebody. He needs to do it. That wasn't the mindset of Nehemiah. Zerubbabel was a governor of the people that led the people on the first campaign to Judah to rebuild the temple. Ezra, we noted, was a descendant of the high priest, descendant of Aaron, and was a spiritual leader for Israel during his day. But Nehemiah, well, we could just say he was a government worker. He worked for the king. And when he saw a need, he didn't say, somebody should do something about it. He said, I should do something about it. And that ought to be our attitude as well. You don't have to be in full-time ministry to become a leader and address the needs of God's people. Secondly, pray about everything. When Nehemiah heard the news, the first thing he did was fall to his knees and start praying. You might say Nehemiah was a leader from the knees up. In the entire book of Nehemiah, we're going to see 14 prayers that he shares with us. Nehemiah was a man of prayer. Whether it was spending hours in prayer to God or in just the moment saying, Lord, help me, he prayed to God. We need to be that kind of person. Pray all the time. We also need to learn to care about the things of God. That's what weighed on Nehemiah's heart. That's why when the men came back from Judah, he responded the way he did. First thing he wanted to know wasn't how was your journey, it was how are the people of God back in Judah. He cared about it. Also, God leads different people in different ways. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on this, but when Ezra went from the capital of Persia to Judah, he didn't take a whole lot of people with him. He didn't ask the king for an army, partly because he was afraid to, because he told the king that our God will be with us. But Nehemiah had half the army of Persia with him. God leads people in different ways. And we shouldn't look at others and say, why can't I have that? Why can't I do that? We should be asking, what can I do? And then rise to the occasion. And God sees your faithfulness. No matter how great or how small of service you provide, whether others take notice of it or not, God does see it. So trust in him like Nehemiah did and become a leader among God's people. That's all our thoughts for today. We're out of time. Appreciate your attention. Next week we'll get into Nehemiah 4 and 5 and I think also chapter 6. Thank you.